May 14th, 2026. These are the most important stories since yesterday. In tech, the UK AI Security Institute, Palo Alto Unit 42, and Microsoft's MDASH program separately documented frontier AI completing 32-step autonomous cyberattack chains end-to-end, with Microsoft shipping 16 Windows patches built by an internal AI auditor in the same news cycle. In governance, Musk versus Altman reached closing arguments after a final day of evidence in which Altman testified that Musk had said OpenAI succession should pass to my children, a moment that Altman called hair-raising, and Musk himself remained on judicial recall status while traveling to China on a state visit. In energy, Fervo Energy closed the first next-generation geothermal IPO at a $7.7 billion valuation, with 650 megawatts contracted and a 3.65 gigawatt pipeline. In medicine, a Nature paper mapped 427,000 single cells from 119 triple-negative breast cancer patients and identified 4 tumor ecotypes that predict chemotherapy response better than every prior biomarker for the disease. In AI, Anthropic surpassed OpenAI in entrepreneur customer share at 34.4% against 32.3%, as the same week documented ordinary professionals shipping working software through conversational coding without ever opening a traditional IDE. In science, a protein-based ancient genetics technique resolved a previously unknown introgression event from Homo erectus into the Denisovan lineage using 6 teeth from China, opening tens of thousands of tropical specimens that DNA never could. Also in medicine, researchers identified ZFP384 as the transcriptional regulator that keeps the brain's repair crew working through the long tail after a stroke, opening a therapeutic window current medicine barely touches. In infrastructure, NEMA projected U.S. electricity demand will grow 55% by 2050, financed by the same long tenor offtake contracts that are driving the load. Deeper dives on all of this are in today's Century Report, and many are discussed further in today's podcast. Links to both are in the description. Or if you're already here on the podcast, let's get into it now. Okay, 3 findings landed in the same news cycle this week, and they describe the same trajectory from 3 different vantage points. The UK AI Security Institute documented frontier models completing 32-step autonomous cyberattack chains end-to-end in controlled red team environments. Reconnaissance, vulnerability discovery, exploit chaining, execution. No human in the loop between the first move and the last. Palo Alto's Network Unit 42 published a parallel assessment estimating the diffusion window before equivalent offensive capability becomes accessible outside the frontier labs at 3 to 5 months. That's a compression of the 6 to 12-month window that Anthropic's own offensive cyber lead gave publicly in the April 12th edition of the Century Report. And the third piece, Microsoft disclosed that an internal AI auditor, they call the program MDASH, surfaced 16 previously undocumented Windows vulnerabilities, several rated critical, that shipped as patches in this month's Patch Tuesday cycle. Stay on that for a little bit. The same architectural class of system that can chain 32 steps to break into a network can also walk through Microsoft's own source code, find 16 holes that nobody else had reported, and produce the patches. Microsoft just put those patches on the laptops of every nurse, school administrator, accountant, and small business owner running Windows in the next update, before the exploits arrive, before the vulnerabilities became something that an attacker could buy. Now, I want to be careful about what actually happened here. The UK AISI work and the Unit 42 work describe demonstrated capability in controlled environments. Now, the Microsoft side, though, is different. Those 16 patches are real. They are deployed, and they are running on the machines of hundreds of millions of users already this week. The capability and the response are landing in the same news cycle, run by the same class of systems, sometimes by the same labs. For 2 decades, the architecture that cyber operations ran on was offensive asymmetry. A vulnerability researcher with the right tools could find, weaponize, and deploy an exploit faster than defenders working at smaller scale on the other side could detect or patch. That gap was the business model. Ransomware, state campaigns against critical infrastructure, intellectual property theft, all of that ran on the assumption that offense scaled but defense did not, or at least it did so slower. What 3 independent disclosures in 1 week describe is what happens when both sides scale together. The labs publishing the offensive demonstrations are publishing the defensive results. in the same news cycle. Now, a reasonable read of this week's evidence is that the marginal asymmetry has begun to bend back toward defense. The verification layer forming around that, such as the EU preview access talks on GPT 5.5 cyber, the Five Eyes coordination, the IMF spring meetings that pulled financial regulators into the picture, all of which we've covered here on the Century Report, that is being assembled at the pace that the capability is being assembled. The running record on this ARC going back to February lives in the ARCs tracker on the website. If you run a small business on a Windows machine, the 16 patches that shipped this month close holes that you didn't know your laptop had. The same kind of system that could have been used to find and exploit those holes was used to find and close them first. Okay, different story, same architectural class of question, AI governance. Musk versus Altman reached closing arguments in U.S. District Court in Oakland. Yesterday was the final day of evidence. Closing statements are wrapping up, even probably as you listen to this. The case is about whether OpenAI's transition from a charitable nonprofit to a public benefit corporation, the legal scaffolding underneath which the company has become, is sustainable under the founding commitments that the parties made when they put OpenAI together in 2015. That description sounds really dry, but it is anything but. The same legal architecture is the one that Anthropic operates under. The same architecture is the one that the next dozen labs will likely adopt. The verdict will mark a huge precedent. What landed in yesterday's testimony is really worth your attention. Joshua Akyem testified. He joined OpenAI as an intern in 2017. He is now the company's chief futurist. He studies how society is changing in response to AI. Akyem described a moment in 2018 when Elon Musk was leaving the OpenAI board, and Akyem, at the time a junior employee, interrupted Musk's parting remarks to warn that pursuing AGI at Tesla would compromise the safety practices that both organizations had been building together. Musk allegedly responded by calling him a jackass. OpenAI's lawyer tried to admit that the trophy Akyem's colleagues later gave him, never stopped being a jackass for safety, into evidence. The judge declined to take physical possession, but allowed the testimony. The trophy is part of the public record now. So is the principle that Akyem was defending, that an intern can interrupt a billionaire's exit speech to defend a safety commitment, and the company will commemorate it 8 years later in open court. Then Altman testified. Under cross-examination, the Ars Technica headline framed it as a forced to confront claims that he's a prolific liar, which is Musk's lawyer's framing, not the verdict. I want to be clear on that. What Altman actually said on the stand is more interesting, though. He testified that Musk had wanted control, total control, of OpenAI from the beginning, and when Altman asked who might eventually succeed Musk if he kept that control, Musk reportedly replied that control should pass to my children. Altman called that moment particularly hair-raising, and that was when Altman concluded that Musk would never voluntarily cede control. So let's slow down and look at that for a minute. The two co-founders of one of the most consequential companies in the world are in open court under oath telling the public that the disagreement at the founding was about who would own the trajectory of AGI if it actually worked. One founder thought the answer was the nonprofit that they had built together. The other thought it was his children. That is the foundational question of how an emerging intelligence should be governed, being argued by the people whose decisions a year ago and a decade ago will shape who gets to make decisions a decade from now. Meanwhile, Musk himself was in China this week on a state visit with the U.S. president, despite being on judicial recall status. The judge had not formally excused him, but he left anyway. Closing arguments proceeded without him. The verdict matters past this headline. Musk seeks up to $150 billion in damages, which he has stated that he would donate to OpenAI's nonprofit if he wins. OpenAI's signaled IPO is being pursued at a valuation near $1 trillion, and the financing depends on the legal architecture that this trial is testing. If the jury finds the conversion materially breached the founding commitments, the precedent reaches well beyond OpenAI, into Anthropic, into every lab, using the same template. If the jury finds the conversion was sustainable, that is also a precedent, clarifying for every subsequent lab that the same path is open. The trial record itself has already done something that this publication's coverage has been tracking since the trial opened back on April 28th. Mira Murati's testimony in May that Altman misrepresented legal clearance to bypass the Deployment Safety Board. The April 30th disclosures about Musk's halted billion-dollar pledge in 2017 and his attempts to recruit OpenAI researchers to Tesla while he was still serving on the board. XAI's acknowledged distillation of OpenAI models to train Grok. The court record now contains a level of detail about how a frontier AI lab actually operates internally that no other discovery process has ever assembled. That record will inform how the next generation of labs are governed from day one, regardless of how the jury rules. So, if you've ever wondered who actually makes the decisions inside the labs producing the systems that are starting to compound across the rest of this week's news cycle and our world, the cyber defenders that we just talked about, the cancer atlases we're about to get to, the conversational coding tools millions of people are starting to use, the answer is in the trial record. It is in the testimony. The two co-founders said out loud under oath what the disagreement at the founding was actually about. That record is going to inform how the next 10 years of AI governance look regardless of which way the jury falls. Okay, shifting away here. Different story, but same architectural thread. The Verge published a long feature this week that the editors called the Personal Software Revolution. The piece centers on Anthropic's Claude code and the broader category of conversational coding tools. What it documents is named individuals. A school teacher in Washington State, a finance manager at a mid-sized company, a small business operator running a logistics outfit, building working applications, deploying them for their own use, solving specific problems no commercial software vendor had ever addressed. The reason no vendor addressed those problems is that the market was too narrow to justify a product. The economics of commercial software for 50 years demanded a market large enough to amortize development costs. Anything below that threshold got handled with spreadsheets, paper, or a workaround. Tens of millions of narrow workflows just kind of lived in that gap. What The Verge documents is that the cost of writing a small, purpose-built application has fallen below the cost of those workarounds for a widening band of problems. And the person closest to the problem is, of course, the one building the app, because they're the only one who actually understands the requirement. Now, in the same news cycle, the number underneath the story showed up. Ramp's enterprise spend data showed Anthropic surpassing OpenAI in business customer share, 34.4% against 32.3%, driven heavily by Claude code adoption. OpenAI responded by offering the Codex tool free for 2 months, and Anthropic then raised Claude Code's weekly usage limits by 50% on the same day. The surface read of that exchange is competitive maneuvering, two big AI labs racing for market share, each giving more away in order to grab more. But there's also a deeper read. Conversational coding is the category representing the primary near-term revenue stream for both labs, and the labs are racing to compress the price of that category toward zero. They're racing toward ubiquity. The margin can wait. Both companies have looked at the curve in front of them clearly enough to conclude that getting widely used now matters more than monetizing that use later. The structural shift sitting underneath all of that is that the population that can describe a problem precisely enough is becoming the population that can solve it with intelligence. The assumption that software creation requires a specialized professional class trained in syntax and semantics has been carrying the entire shape of the industry for nearly half a century. So it's a big deal now that it's no longer carrying. So if you sat at your work and thought there's got to be a tool for this or an app for that, and you've gone looking but not found one because the problem you have is too specific to your role, your team, or your particular workflow, chances are you may have already tried AI and found a great solution. And that's what's been changing, is now this is something you can describe into existence. A teacher figuring out how to give faster feedback on student work. A finance staffer figuring out how to track a category their accounting software simply ignores. A small business owner figuring out how to schedule something with their specific constraints. The boundary between using software and making it is dissolving for the entire class of problems that has been stranded inside that gap for 50 years. What this means for the people who have spent their careers on the professional side of that boundary as knowledge workers, such as the engineers and the developers, that's the harder question. But it's a question that is proliferating into every field right now. So a deeper look at this one is in today's edition of the Century Report. Switching domains, let's get into medicine. A paper landed in Nature this week describing the largest single cell map of triple negative breast cancer assembled to date: 427,000 cells, 119 patients. The team behind it identified four distinct tumor ecotypes, patterns made up of the tumor cells themselves, the immune cells around them, and the stromal architecture holding it all together. Each ecotype carries a measurably different response to standard neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So, two of the four ecotypes show response rates above 70%. One shows response rates below 25%. The fourth carries a distinct mechanism of resistance that points towards specific combination therapies that are already in trial. So let's slow down. What does that mean clinically? Triple negative breast cancer is the most aggressive subtype and the one with the fewest targeted therapies. Roughly half of patients fail to respond to the standard regimen. So until this paper, clinicians had no reliable way to know in advance which patients those were. The treatment got chosen and the patient endured months of toxic draining therapy, and then everyone found out together whether the tumor had been responding. The classifier in this paper was validated across multiple independent cohorts. It outperforms every prior biomarker for this disease. Now, what does that mean in practice versus what it doesn't mean? The capability has been demonstrated. A patient diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer could, in principle, be sorted into a high probability response group, a low probability group, or a group whose specific resistance signature matches another active trial. What stands between the paper and that conversation is, of course, the deployment work. The single cell sequencing platforms have to be available in the clinical pipeline, not just in a research lab. The classifier has to clear regulatory review, and the hospital infrastructure has to integrate the assay into pre-treatment decision flow. None of that is overnight work. But what this paper does is move the date when that conversation becomes accessible. It doesn't make it accessible tomorrow. The deeper signal underneath this finding is what's changing in oncology more broadly. Single cell sequencing at the scale this paper used was a multi-year, multi-million-dollar undertaking just a few years ago. The same data can now be generated for a fraction of the cost and turnaround. Generating the data has become the affordable part. The clinical infrastructure to act on what the data reveals is the slower piece. That infrastructure is being built, slower than the data is arriving, but it is being built. So if you or someone you love is in the diagnostic window for an aggressive cancer right now, the standard of care today is the standard that's very likely about to change. The date depends, of course, on what each hospital and each regulator does next. Last story for today. Fervo Energy went public this week. $1.9 billion raised, $7.7 billion valuation. First enhanced geothermal company on public markets. Quick context on what Fervo actually does. They drill horizontal wells through hot, dry rock, the way that shale operators drill for gas. They fracture the rock to create a closed-loop heat exchanger. They circulate water through it. Hot water comes back up and runs through a turbine and then generates the electricity. Continuous and carbon-free. Follows load. Their commissioned plant at Cape Station in Utah is already running at 100 megawatts, with 400 megawatts contracted to the Southern California Edison and Shell Energy. 658 megawatts of long-term power purchase agreements signed. A 3.65 gigawatt project pipeline behind that. What the IPO actually prices is the geographic argument. For a long time, the standard read on geothermal was that the resource was real, but the geography was narrow. Iceland, the geysers, a handful of places where hot rock sat shallow enough to reach. The drilling stack that Fervo borrowed from shale collapses that geographic constraint. Hot dry rock exists almost everywhere under the continental crust, at depths that the shale revolution made simply routine. The marginal cost of accessing it has fallen far enough that hyperscalers signing 15-year offtake contracts are putting it on the same shortlist as solar plus storage. Underneath the IPO is the assumption being dissolved here. The standard read of the next decade of grid planning was that intermittent renewables would do most of the work, and the gap, the load that solar and wind can't cover at, say, 3 in the morning, would need to be filled with either new nuclear timelines or fossil backup. That gap had a name, and the name was firm power. Firm power, though, has a new occupant. And in the same news cycle, the National Electric Manufacturers Association published a forecast that U.S. electricity consumption will grow 55% by 2050. AI data centers, electrification of transport and heat, reshored manufacturing. That's a structural step up, not a gradual build out. And the same forecast that names the demand also describes what's being built to meet it. Utility scale solar at record pace, battery storage doubling roughly every 18 months, and now a public market valuation for firm, clean geothermal at continental scale. The grid that emerges from this decade is going to be substantially larger, substantially cleaner, and substantially more responsive than the one that entered it. Fervo's IPO is the market pricing a piece of that grid that the standard forecast did not have a column for. All right, closing out for today, let's pull it all together. The thread running through all of this is what capability access actually looks like when it widens. 3 labs disclose in the same news cycle that frontier models can chain 32 autonomous attack steps, and Microsoft ships 16 patches built by the same class of system on the laptops of hundreds of millions of users before the exploits arrive. The trial that has been shaping the legal foundation under the AI industry reaches closing arguments in Oakland with the founding question: who owns the trajectory of AGI if it actually works? Argued under oath by the 2 co-founders of the company that built ChatGPT. 2 AI labs race to compress the price of conversational coding toward zero, and the people building software this week include a school teacher in Washington and a finance staffer at a mid-sized company. A 427,000 cell atlas of an aggressive cancer demonstrates that pre-treatment stratification can outperform every prior biomarker for the disease. A geothermal company that didn't exist on public markets before this week carries a $7.7 billion valuation and a 3.65 gigawatt pipeline for firm, clean power that the prior decade's grid forecast did not have a category for. What's actually happening underneath all of these stories is the same thing. The substrate is being rebuilt by systems that scale on both sides at once: offense and defense, demand and supply, capability, and the institutional layer the capability needs to land inside. The labs and the researchers and the operators publishing this week are publishing in ways that compound for everyone who picks the publication up. The day's evidence is that access to capability is widening at a rate that the surface narratives keep missing. The labs building the offensive systems are publishing the defensive results. The companies racing for the conversational coding markets are racing toward giving it away. The cost curves on firm clean power have started to do the procurement work decades of policy advocacy could not move. And the substrate underneath medicine and energy and software is becoming legible at a level the prior decade simply did not have. But we do. We'll see you tomorrow.